Welcome, readers, to a Tattered Cover virtual event. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Adam, and I work at Tattered Cover. It's the largest independent bookstore in Colorado. Thank you so much for supporting independent bookstores and joining us tonight. We would not be here without you. 2021 is actually our 50th anniversary, so thank you so much for supporting us for half a century. Before I go any further, there is closed captioning that you can find at the bottom of your page. It has a black label that says CC. Please click it if you have any need for closed captioning or you want it on. Please check out tatteredcover.com/event for more virtual author events. Upcoming, we have Lin-Manuel Miranda, famous from Hamilton. Him and his friends are putting out a companion book for his new movie, In the Heights. That's going to be on June 15th. You can find out more info at tatteredcover.com. Tonight, I'm super excited to introduce the author of The Dead Husband, Carter Wilson. He will be in conversation tonight with David Bell. Carter Wilson is a USA Today and #1 Denver Post best-selling author of 7 critically acclaimed standalone psychological thrillers, as well as numerous short stories. He is an ITW Thriller Award finalist, a 4-time winner of the Colorado Book Award, and his novels have received multiple starred reviews in Publishers Weekly, Booklist, the Library Journal. He lives in Erie, Colorado, in a Victorian house that is spooky but isn't haunted yet. And David Bell is a USA Today bestselling author of 11 novels from Berkeley Penguin, including Kill All Your Darlings, The Request, Layover, Somebody's Daughter, and many, many more. Please welcome Carter and David, who will be talking tonight about Carter's most recent book, The Dead Husband, and I'll turn it over to them in just a second. There they are. Take it away, gentlemen.
Hey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks all of you for tuning in, and thanks to Tattered Cover. It's really an honor to be participating in an event, even virtually, at such a legendary bookstore. And it's even better to be chatting with my friend Carter Wilson. I remember a few years ago, I went to Thriller Fest in New York. I'd heard of this guy, Carter Wilson, and his books. And then I went to Thriller Fest, and this guy, Carter Wilson, was nominated for the International Thriller Award. And I thought, who is this jerk who's nominated for this award that I'm not nominated for? And then about a year later, we met at another conference, VoucherCon, and he turned out to be a charming, funny guy, just as intelligent and interesting as his books. So I'm thrilled that he asked me to come along. And there's The Dead Husband, as you can see right there. And you should all buy a copy from Tattered Cover. If you can, support your independent bookstore. So Carter, how's it going?
David, it's going well. Thank you so much for doing this. And I'll just note that I did not win that award, but thanks for being jealous. So jealousy is part of the whole kind of writing community.
It is, but it's an honor just to be nominated, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think I lost to Jane Harper. So I'm like, all right, okay, I get that.
Tough to compete with Jane Harper.
Yeah.
Gotta say, she's a good writer. So The Dead Husband is your 7th book, and you've got a lot of readers who come back for your books over and over again. I'm sure your publisher says to you every year, we need a Carter Wilson book, because you're kind of a Carter Wilson book, but it can't be exactly the same as the other books you've done. So I'm kind of wondering how you go about coming up with that Carter Wilson book every year that your readers want to read, but is not too much like the other 6 books that have gone before. What is that process like when you're coming up with that new idea and not trying to repeat yourself too much?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we both write standalones, right? And you have your 11th is coming out, and that's a pretty rarefied breed that does that with psychological thrillers. You know, series are very popular, but honestly, I've never been in the position until recently where it's been like, okay, we're going to give you a 3-book deal and we need to know what each one is about. It's been a book by book effort with me. So I write a book that that entertains me, and then I hope it sells. And like you, I'm not particularly interested in continuing most stories. That if I ever did, it would be maybe for another book or so. I just think of an opening scene that'll come to me that I won't understand. I don't know who these characters are, or why they're doing what they're doing, but it's just some weird, cool scene that if I saw it in a TV show or if I read it in a book, I'd be compelled. And then since I don't outline, I spend literally the rest of the book trying to figure out what that scene means. And it's just a puzzle for me. So in the case of The Dead Husband, I pictured this mid-30s woman standing at this massive wooden front door of this mansion where she grew up, and she's returning home, and she's got her son with her, and she's got this kind of sense of dread. And that was kind of it. I didn't know who she was, who the kid was, why she's coming home. And that was my starting point.
Well, now it's interesting that you say that you don't really make an outline or plan things, because your books seem very intricate and complicated and well thought out. And yet you're kind of making it up as you go along. And so I'm wondering, what's it like when those surprises come up in your book? Like what, or maybe you're just surprised every day because you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I guess, do you start, the days writing, do you know even that much? Like, I'm going to write chapter 20 and, the character has to get, across town in this chat, like how are you even thinking that far ahead when you sit down?
It depends on where I am, but for the first 100 pages, I have zero idea every day. And I'm continuously asking myself, what if this happened? Is that interesting? Or what does that do? And when you get to those points, I'd say probably around 2/3 of the way through, when you start to see things kind of reveal themselves to you, and hopefully your subconscious is kind of working the whole time in the background, and you start to realize, like, oh, this is what this book is about. That is completely the joy of writing to me, is that unveiling, and having that night where you're just sitting there writing like, oh, this is really cool. This is what it all means. Of course, now I have to go change everything that I've written, but this is where I was getting to. Or if there was a big twist, I usually don't see the twist until maybe that chapter that I'm writing it. And then it, reveals itself to me. And I'm like, oh, that's fun. And if I don't see it coming, hopefully the readers don't see it coming either. But so sure, there's a lot of editing, but I couldn't do it any other way, because that's the pure joy of writing to me, is unveiling, every day.
I mean, do you worry that if you made a really detailed outline, because I've heard some writers say this, if they made a really detailed outline and they knew everything that was going to happen, they might not be interested in writing the book, right?
Yeah.
I feel like that you would lose some magic if you knew what was happening.
I'll give you a good example. One of my earlier books, I tried outlining because, when I was learning how to write, you realize you hear a lot that's what people do. I'm like, okay, I'll give this a try. And I outlined probably the first half of the book. Very first chapter, this dude, the protagonist, is driving on the Beltway in DC. And I'm following the outline, and then he gets out, and I wanted to show that he was, he's likable. So he actually stops to help a stranded motorist. And then as I'm writing this chapter, I realized he's got to get hit by a car. He's in and so I had him get hit by a car.
Yeah. Okay.
And it totally changed the entire trajectory of the book, because that became very meaningful. And I'm like, all right, I can't outline, because I get too excited about these ideas that pop into my head as I'm writing. And I don't know, are you the same way?
Well, I make a pretty detailed outline. It sounds really scary to me to not have the detailed outline, that I would worry that, and they always change as I go along. There are surprises, and I think you're right to say, if you're surprised by it, then the reader's probably going to be surprised by it. Like, if the person writing the book is surprised and doesn't see something coming, then yeah, chances are the reader's going to be surprised.
But how much time do you spend before you start the writing process doing that outline? Like months, or?
It can be months.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'm not as much of a detail person. My editor is more of a detail person. So yeah, it's like it answers a lot of questions for me. And so the idea of just like, yeah, just jump in without an outline, that would kind of scare me. I would feel lost. Maybe
but it's funny, like we get, I was just going to say, we get to this place in our careers where, you know, you realize like, oh, this is how I do it. And I don't think I'm going to change because I don't, you know, I'm kind of set in my ways now. I mean, I think it would be so hard for me to sit. Sometimes I'll outline like a few chapters ahead, you know, and if I have to give a synopsis on something that I'm selling, I'll give them the first half and know that it's probably going to change.
Okay. I mean, yeah, so you might make a few notes on going ahead, but yeah, well, it's interesting that you said that you have to accept that's the way you are. I mean, that's advice I always give to writing students, is just part of it's just a process of finding out what works best for you. You know, like you work best with an outline or you work best without an outline, and that's kind of how it goes. It's interesting that you said all your books are standalones, and I don't think this is spoiling anything about The Dead Husband, but everything is wrapped up in The Dead Husband, but like there's a little like door open that there could be more from these characters. Like, you know, is this tempting you to return to these characters someday, some way, you know?
Well, I will say, so I set The Dead Husband in this fictional town of Bury, New Hampshire, which is a very affluent community where it's fairly insidious and everybody kind of knows everything about each other. And there's a lot of kind of malevolence working behind the scenes. And specifically it's set in this house. And I wanted the house to be a major menacing, looming character in this book. And so before I even sold the book after this one, I decided to write it. And because I wasn't done with, not necessarily these characters, I wasn't done with Barry and this house. So the next book coming out next year is the same town and the same house, just totally different characters. Mm-hmm. And it interplays with these characters as well. But it was sold as a standalone novel. I kind of call it a companion novel, but you don't have to have read either one to enjoy each one, I think. So yeah, and then I think eventually I would like to explore a little bit more about, you know, what is the final resolution? Because I left the ending a little vague, which I prefer to do. I love that, and much to the chagrin of a lot of my readers who like things like tidied up, but. You know, I'm somebody who loved the ending of The Sopranos. I want to make my own assumptions about what happened.
I think it's a lot harder to do that, to leave something slightly open to the reader's imagination and still satisfy. You know, I think that's a much tougher thing to pull off. You did it here in The Dead Husband, but it's a very difficult trick to pull off if you can do it right.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate that. And that's where you rely on the advice of your editor, right? Because you get so close to the book and you know that this is satisfying to you, but you don't really have that perspective of the marketplace. And it was actually interesting in this book, I had actually written more of a conclusive ending. And then my editor came back to me and kind of made a note about 20 pages before the ending of the book and said, this feels like the emotional ending to me. And so I had to really sit with that and like, oh, okay. And I ended up agreeing with her. And so it's actually even more vague than it originally was.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I mean, I think people sometimes think like, okay, you're writing a commercial book, you're writing a thriller, there's like a formula, there's certain expectations.
Oh God, there's no formula.
Well, I'm just saying, you know, it's good to know that there's the possibility to have that ambiguity, to have that openness, right? And then not everything has to be nailed down, and that your editor's on board with it. If that's your vision, that you're aligning with your editor on that idea. I think that's a really interesting thing.
Yeah, and I definitely, you know, it's not like I acquiesce to whatever she wants, but I've always come from the perspective from somebody who never had written anything, you know, creatively until my 30s. and coming from a very like, hey, what's the best route here? I look at her advice. I'm like, yeah, you're right, because you get so deep into your novel, as you know, that you what you think you might like might not be actually with a better perspective the right thing to do. So she's almost always always right. She's always making the book better, and I am so always grateful for that.
She's listening right now probably, and she's like recording this part of the interview.
Oh, I hope so. That's the only reason.
She's like, see, he thinks I'm always right. And she'll play that back the next time you are discussing a book. She'll see like,
Right.
see, I'm always right.
Right.
It's interesting that you mentioned the house in the story, which is kind of, one of the things I really like about your stories is they're thrillers, they're mysteries, they fit that genre, but there's always like this creepy, almost gothic-y kind of feel sometimes to your stories as well, which makes them unique. They kind of operate, on the borderland between some different genres, and that house being this weird space, this almost haunted, cold house in the book. I guess, again, it goes back to, are you consciously doing that? Is that just the way you see the world when you're telling a story? You're just like, I gotta bring some of these creepier elements in here. I'm not afraid to get on the borderland between a couple different genres and put some different ingredients in there and shake it up. Like, how do you feel about that and that mixture that you seem to conjure very well?
Yeah, I mean, I think creepiness is something that I strive for in all of my books. I think it's something, honestly, I think I do it well, and I think it's interesting to me. And I'm not so interested in overt graphic violence, despite some of the things that I've written, or horror, but mood is very important to me. And in the case of this house, I mean, it's not what you would consider a typical creepy house. It's a mansion, but it was built in the 1980s. It's kind of that flavor of architecture. But I wanted it to be, I kind of wanted it to be a haunted house story in a way. And so I wanted to make sure that when people walked in there was an energy that they felt if they were receptive to that kind of a thing. But, there are no ghosts. But there's a mood and there's a tension and there's a paranoia that, I strive to kind of have as an underlying theme in all of my books, because I think that's interesting to me. And I think readers respond to it.
Yeah. Mood is a good word. The mood, the atmosphere is very creepy and strange and disquieting, even though it's set, like you said, just kind of in an affluent suburb. Although I would say, like, probably most 80s architecture is probably creepy, right? Like,
Right.
People running around with shoulder pads and giant.
Yeah, it's horrifying.
Yeah, and a lot of brass fixtures is probably all
very shiny.
Very disturbing. Yeah, no, but I think you do that very well, and it does. I mean, to me, that's the thing that makes your books unique. There are so many thrillers, and there's some really good ones. Sometimes it can seem all the same, but that's kind of like, to me, that's your territory, is that weird little space where it's that weird mood and there's the suspense and everything. So,
well, I mean, isn't that
really
what you strive for as well with standalones? I mean, one of the things that's most satisfying to me is whether somebody likes the book or doesn't. If they say, I haven't seen anything like this, that to me is highly rewarding, as opposed to like, yeah, this is another summer read that I've, dime a dozen plot line. I want them to say that this was really weird and kind of creepy and kind of disturbing. I don't quite know what I think about it, but I can't stop thinking about it. That's the best praise I can get.
Okay. Well, I think that's what you do. I think your books, because of that atmosphere, they linger a little bit. I think the best books linger with the reader, linger in the reader's mind, and maybe it's not a book even that you love, but like something hangs with you for a while. And like, if you can stick in a reader's mind,
right. Like a virus.
Thing, Yeah, right. Exactly. Maybe it's too soon to make a virus joke.
That's never too soon.
Since you mentioned virus, I mean, I'm kind of wondering, I've heard some writers say that during the pandemic, it was very difficult for them to write. And other writers have said during the pandemic, they were highly productive because they were just like stuck at home and whatever. It's probably like in direct proportion to how many children, small children you have running around your house.
Yeah.
But I guess, so obviously some of this book must have been written in those times, you know, like, did that affect you? Were you more productive, less productive? Were you just, you know, in the usual zone and tried to block it all out?
Yeah. I mean, I think I was in the usual zone because I only write about an hour a day. So, you know, it wasn't hard for me to find that time. And fortunately, my kids are 17 and 15. So, you know, that wasn't the issue with being at home. The only thing that really affected—
kids want you to ignore them, right?
Right, exactly. The only thing that affected me was actually, so this book was done, and this book was the ending of this book was to take place basically at the end of 2019 initially. But the next book takes place 6 months after the end of this book. And I'm like, okay, I can't have, I don't want to set my next book in and I can't not mention the pandemic. So I ended up backdating both novels a couple years. So this book got set back to 2017 or something like that. So that was the only major thing that I had. But I mean, so many of our friends had books coming out last year and started this whole virtual touring and all that kind of stuff. So I was kind of happy I didn't have anything coming out last year.
You know, it's an interesting, that's a question that's come up with a lot of writers is, if you were writing a book during the pandemic that was clearly going to come out either during or just after the pandemic, do you mention it? You know, like you include that because it's such a massive event. And it's like, if you had written a book that was set in 1947, would you pretend like World War II had never happened, right?
Right, and you can't, because that informs everything.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question that people have had to deal with as writers, you know, like, do you, or like, you know, you can like backdate it before the pandemic or, you know, anyway.
I think one of the things that, you know, actually just thinking on it further a little bit, one of the things that maybe it did behind the scenes, it being the pandemic, is it has, and, you know, honestly, the last 4 years has created in me a sense of nostalgia, you know, and maybe that's just also me getting older, but just looking back. And so then what I'm writing now takes place in 1987 because it just feels comforting to me. And it's not at all just to avoid, you know, having to write about the pandemic. It's just, I have this heavy sense of nostalgia that just is kind of like settled on to me. And it's a blast writing this book, even though it's, you know, it's creepy and it's scary and all this stuff, but it's nice to kind of go back to my childhood a little bit.
Well, what are you enjoying, like the music references and things like that?
Well, so and I have a whole scene in a mall, and I have to make sure, like, you know, this person walks into a video game arcade, and okay, what games had been released by this date? So now all of a sudden you're on the internet researching everything, and it's just like, you know, I was 17, you know, in 1987, so I was like, oh yeah, Walden Books, I remember that.
I was 17 in 1987 too, but it would be weird to think about because like it's not like I think of that as like the high point of my life, but I certainly understand the nostalgia about the music and that time and
there's something beautiful about setting a book when there are no phones. You know, when you set a thriller in an area in a time when you have no access to information or to help at your fingertips, it becomes much more intriguing.
Yeah, you know, cell phones and the internet have been hell for thriller writers because people are never out of touch. How do you disappear when everybody has a tracking device in their pocket and you can get on the internet and look someone up and all your information is there? And you can
going off the grid is a much more tenuous thing to do these days.
I mean, when we, you know, like before that, you could disappear from people just right in the same town. And like,
you could literally show up at a new job and say, this is my name. And they're like, okay.
Yeah. Not that we were thinking of doing anything illegal. I'm just, you know, it's all speculation. It's all fiction.
Yep. Yes.
Now, so you said something interesting before we came on. We were chatting. You talked about how you did not really read a lot growing up until you got into your 20s or so. And that's kind of a question that comes up a lot. It's like, why do you write thrillers? And like, did you read these kinds of books when you were growing up? So just like, how did that happen that you started reading? And I guess like, what did you start reading when you really became a reader? And then like, how did that lead to thrillers? Because I've heard you've talked about books that you like and you read a diverse palette of authors all over the map. So like, how did that kind of lead to you writing these thrillers?
Yeah, I mean, my reading journey was probably just, I just started getting interested in novels after having read the requisite things in high school and then having to gone to essentially a business school for college where I didn't have to read any fiction at all. And I don't think I actually did. That I just kind of got naturally interested, I think, in writing or in reading in my 20s. And my parents were always big readers. But I don't think I got consumed by it. It became one of several interesting hobbies to me. But I didn't start writing until so my actual inflection point's a little interesting, I think. Like when I was 33, I was taking a class, and this is as exciting as it sounds, for continuing education for an appraisal license, a real estate license I used to have. So this is mind-numbing class, 8 hours in a Ramada shitty ballroom kind of a situation. And I was so bored. And I posed myself a murder mystery riddle that I just made up on the spot. And I'm like, okay, for the last 2 hours of this class, I'm going to figure out the answer to this riddle. And I couldn't figure it out. And when I got home, I kept thinking about this stupid riddle. And I started writing about it and figuring out what is the backstory that explains all of this. And 90 days later, I had a 400-page manuscript. And I had never done anything. It was really an epiphany for me. And I didn't tell anybody I was doing it, not even my wife at the time. I finished this manuscript, which I knew wasn't any good, but I did it. Mm-hmm. And I kind of thought, holy hell, maybe this is what I should be doing. I mean, this is meaningful, whether it's good or not, it's meaningful that I did this out of nowhere. And I haven't stopped writing since, but, so that was really how I started writing. And that's how I write today, is like, I pose myself that riddle. I think of that opening scene that I don't understand, and I spend the rest of the book trying to figure it out. And I realize it's exactly how I started back, all those years ago.
Now, do you have to go to a seminar at a Ramada Inn in order to begin the book? Do you like sign up for a sales seminar and wait to be extremely bored, before you do it? Or can you do it without the Ramada?
I can do it without that. And sometimes there'll just be something that triggers like, oh, what a weird thought that is. Let me write that down. Or maybe somebody will mention something to me and I'm like, what if X? And that might be all the seed you need to germinate an entire book. So I never really have struggled for ideas. By the time I'm done with something, I've probably been having an idea for that opening scene of the next book for a few months already.
And you said something in that answer about how it was, even if the book wasn't any good, this first book you wrote, even if it wasn't any good, it was meaningful to you because you'd done it. And I guess one of the lessons that I have to think about, and I'm just curious to know what you think about it, is like, you kind of have to hang on to that attitude even once you're a published writer, right? I mean, like there's so much external stuff that we can focus on, but we always have to remember, like, the thing you have control over is the book you're writing and what it means to you and all that. Like, is that something you feel like you're good at doing? Like, do you lose sight of that sometimes and like get caught up in like, oh, I didn't get the review, I didn't get the this, I didn't get the that, right? Or do you feel like you're pretty well focused on like, I wrote the book, I did what I wanted to do, and don't worry so much about all that other stuff that's out of my control?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good practice for life anyway, right? Is being present in the moment and focusing on what's under your control. And as a writer, as so much is out of your control. And I've always taken the attitude of like, how can I help? tell me how I can help, and I'm happy to help. And I'm part of a team, but I'm not going to micromanage anything because I know there's only so much I can do. And if people don't like the book, okay. And I've always done everything by goal. So once I wrote that first book, my goal was just get an agent. That would be cool. That would be cool to have an agent. And then when I landed an agent, it became, just have one book published, because my first 3 books didn't sell. And I always preach about the power of negativity in a way, in terms of rejection, because writers go through a lot of rejection, and rejection can be a wonderful thing because you can learn a lot from it, which I think students would, that's a good lesson for students as well. It's like, lean into that rejection, see why you're being rejected, and learn from it. So yeah, and I've gotten to the point where, the book comes out, and sure, I'll look at the reviews, not obsessively. I'm just kind of curious. But then I'm like, okay, I'm focused on the next thing, and what can we do to keep this train running?
Yeah, I tell my students when they're thinking about, like, oh, should I write my first novel, whatever, when they're in school or right after school. And I always say, well, you have to write your shitty first novel to become better at it, to maybe publish one someday. Because most writers are probably like that. I wrote 4 novels that were unpublished before I published one. So
right. And aren't you glad you didn't self-publish that first one, and that would have been out there today? Because I know people who do that, and that's a detriment, because then editors and publishers will be looking at like, oh, but he's got this out in the market, and that really didn't do anything, and it's self-published. And because there is a huge learning curve, especially when you don't have any background in writing. It took me a long time to figure out how to string 2 sentences together.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm so glad that so many things happened. I mean, at the time I was frustrated saying like, oh, I'm in my 30s, I'm in my late 30s, I'm so old and I haven't published a book. But, the fact is that I think of people who, people who, like you're saying, jump into the pool too soon, or get overwhelmed by things that happen to them when they're young and are not prepared for it. And I was barely prepared for anything, even at my advanced age in my late 30s. So it's sometimes it's hard to be patient, but sometimes patience and letting things play out that way are probably a good idea.
Yeah.
So we've got a few more minutes left before we're going to get some questions, but I do want to ask you about, you kind of talked about what you're writing next and what's going to come next. I do want to mention you started doing your podcast interview series, Making Stuff Up, right? I'm just kind of wondering, a lot of writers, a lot of people are coming up with like podcasts and things like that. Yours is unique in that you're very skilled at interviewing people and making people feel comfortable, and you also have the making stuff up element that happens at the end. I'm just kind of wondering, like, what motivated you to decide to, I mean, you've got enough going on in your life, so like, why did you say like, hey, let me add one more thing to my life that I'm responsible for? But I just like, it seems like it's going very well. What kind of led to you going down that road?
Yeah, I think it was a lot to do with, I mean, I find people very interesting, and I hate small talk, and I'm not good at small talk. And, if I meet you at a cocktail party, I'm going to probably ask you personal questions that might be off-putting, but I'm like, just if we talk about the weather, I'm going to put a bullet in both of our heads. And I love, like, so one of the things that I read the most are biographies. I just love biographies, and I love to read about how people became what they became. So I wanted to talk to writers and not kind of ask the typical writer questions that I get a lot. I wanted to say, like, what was your home life like when you were growing up, and how did you get to do this, and how did that affect that? And I'm talking to writers of all different, from thriller writers like you. We had a great conversation to, National Geographic science writers, people who just love to write. And I'm just curious about their story and their journey. And then at the end of every episode, we pick a random sentence from a random book in those shelves behind me, and we craft a short story together, which is, sometimes amazing, sometimes a shit show, but it's always fun.
Yeah. I mean, where did that idea come from? Like, were you just, like this idea of, I think when I did the interview with you, like I said, you really put me at ease, but it was kind of scary to think of like making something up on the spot.
Totally.
Most writers, we talked about planning and making outlines, but most writers, we're writing like alone. We don't have an audience. It's not like you're performing, but that kind of felt that way. So like that, were you thinking of like, let's put us in a situation that's a little uncomfortable and and see what happens if we're a little off balance,
A little bit, but it's also, I teach these third graders usually once a year at a local elementary school. And part of what I do is I do that. I say, let's make up a story together, and kids will raise their hands. I'm like, give me the next sentence and tell me why this is important. And don't go straight to the action. Give me something about the mood. And, kids just, all their hands are up. All they want to do is like scream out the next sentence. And it just kind of occurred to me, like, why wouldn't I do that with people who write for a living? How interesting would that be to feed on each other's energy? And you're totally right to be nervous, because it's nervous for me because I got to do it every time.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm like, oh shit, I don't know what's next. But it's always so fascinating to me to see how I play off of somebody else who might be in a totally different genre. But and it's always great. So I just thought it would be, and it's different. I haven't seen other podcasts that are doing that, but it's been a lot of fun.
It is. It's a really unique thing that for people to watch on your podcast. And then also I'm glad to hear that you're teaching those third graders about like how to write stories about dismembering bodies and things like that. Because they
already know. They're all watching The Walking Dead. It's crazy.
Oh, they already know. Oh, okay.
Oh, they do. Yeah. Oh, they teach me stuff.
Kids today, right? Okay.
I tell you.
So I think we're going to move on to some questions from the studio audience. So Adam from Tattered Cover is back.
Yeah, definitely. Great conversation. I can't wait to read like those third graders' writings, like when they're published like 20 years from now, they thank you in their acknowledgments, like.
I'm just making more competition for myself.
Yeah.
Exactly. We have a few questions. One is really about, you mentioned another book's coming out next year. How long start to finish does it take both of you, like from inception to turning it into your editor? How long does it take?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for me, for inception, maybe not, but in terms of like, page one, I like to shoot for about 10 months if I can. And that's like finishing the draft, rewriting it a couple times, and then giving it, and then having my girlfriend actually is the one who reads it first and kind of gives it a good editing, and then getting it off to the agent. But it can take longer. What about you, David?
Yeah, it's tough to tell sometimes, because sometimes I'm thinking of an idea long before it starts to form. And then, like when you're writing, a book a year and you're kind of moving along, like it's never straight through on one book, because you always have to stop to go back and like do something for, like copy edit the next book or whatever.
And that could be a month, right? Like when you get your first round edits from your book, it could be a month that you're like, because the editor's like, can you give me a subplot? And you're like, okay, I guess I'm putting this away for a month.
Yeah.
And working on this.
Yeah. So, but about a year, about a year with all of it, like starting to think of the idea and, brainstorm with my editor all the way through, like, it feels like it feels like until the book, like you see the book in your hand, it feels like they're always going to come back and say, could you just do one more thing? We have one more?
Right. Right.
Yeah. Carter, so the companion book to this is publishing next year. You already mentioned. How deep into the next book are you, roughly?
So the book that comes out in 2023, I'm about 50,000 words in, out of, a typical thriller is around 85, 90,000 words for me, at least. But knowing that a lot of it's got to change. So I've got some time to finish it. And I'm trying to be thoughtful, and it's pretty different than what I've been writing. It's still thrillery, but the protagonist is different, and the age is different, and the timeline is different. So yeah. And then I have an idea of what I'm going to write after that.
Sure. Yeah. We have a question about your ideas, and it's about, you mentioned the image, like an image comes up, and then that's kind of what starts the whole process. Like you want to figure out why that image came to your mind. How many ideas do you get, or do you like shut that down when you're writing? Like how many ideas per year are you like thinking of? That maybe not
many,
but they're just okay.
Yeah, not many. It's rare. I mean, honestly, probably like once or twice a year,
Mhm.
I'll think of something or I'll read something. I'm like, oh my God. And I'll write that down, and maybe it's something or not. But I mean, really, like in my process, like I was telling David, I only write about an hour a day.
Mhm.
I shut most of my writing out of my life until I'm sitting down at my laptop, and then I just open up and just let myself kind of be in that moment. But once I'm done, I'm all other aspects of my life. So I don't spend the day thinking about ideas and leaving, notes for myself. That's pretty rare. How about you, Dave? I'm just curious. Like,
Yeah.
are you?
Well, it's weird. I mean, I will usually so like right now I'm in the point, I turned my next book in to my editor a few weeks ago. So I'm waiting to hear back from her. So I'm in this
That's the worst part.
Yeah,
by the way. That's the worst time period.
I'm in the twilight zone right now.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking of ideas for the next book and all that. And so there might be a number of ideas circulating in my brain at that point. It's weird. Once I settle on an idea and my editor's happy with the idea and I'm writing the book, kind of like you, I don't really think of other ideas. And then I get into that book, and occasionally I'll think to myself, when this book is finished, what am I going to do? I don't have any other ideas. What if there's no other idea? Like, what if this is the last idea I've
But that's never happened to you with 11 books, right? So don't you have the confidence that like, I know how, I know how.
No, it might happen. How do you know it's not the last time that it'll ever happen, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So anyway, it feels like one, and then, but you're right. Like I just have to trust that, like when it's time, something will occur to me at some point.
Yeah.
And you both touched upon this like throughout the whole chat, but does it get harder to come up with ideas, or, and I'll add to that, is it more like, are you trying to trick yourselves and come up with something new, and that makes it more difficult for you?
It's a little bit more organic for me. In fact, it's funny. Like I have a buddy of mine who a couple months ago said, "You've got to check out this podcast. It's about," and he probably said one, maybe two sentences, and I'm like, "Stop talking to me," and because I knew there's something about what he just said that triggered. I'm like, "Oh my God, I don't want to know anything else about this podcast," because I want to do a take on it that's like totally different or organic. But just those two sentences hit me in a way that rarely happens, but it happens often enough that it gives me a book idea. What about you, David?
Yeah, the problem is that I've had the same editor for a long time and the same agent for a long time. So there are two people who will always say, like, I'll write something, they'll say like, oh, 3 books ago you killed somebody with a bookend, right? And you can't do that. And so it's like, how many different ways can you come up with for a person to kill somebody, and how many different reasons can you come up with for someone to kill somebody? Like, think about it. People really only kill for like what? Love, money. It's kind of like that. Like it's, so it's like, that's the hard part, is once you've written a few books, you can't be killing somebody the same way, having somebody disappear the same way. It gets more and more challenging in that way. But that's the fun part. I mean, really, like, the coming up with the idea is a lot of the fun.
Totally.
For sure. And one last question. It's from me, actually. It's what have you been reading recently? What's been exciting you? I know, Carter, you said you like biographies, but like any thrillers, biographies, what have you guys enjoyed?
Well, I'll tell you, like my last 2 books have been Obama's new book, which was tremendous and a lot of pages. And I'm reading, this sounds really boring, I know, but I'm reading a biography of Mike Nichols, who was a famous film director and a famous stage director. Directed The Graduate, for example, The Odd Couple. And I just love, I'm like, I don't even know much about this guy, but I want to know how you went through your life and what things made you want to do the next thing. So that's what all of my to be read list is nonfiction at the moment.
Yeah, I've read a couple of good thrillers. One is coming out in August. Richard Chismar wrote the book Chasing the Boogeyman. He's co-written with Stephen King. And this is a really interesting book because it's presented as though it's true crime, almost like a documentary novel. It's not, it's all made up, but he's included all these like maps and photographs and so that it seems like reading something real about this murder in this town. But like, as I was reading the book, I was constantly saying like, this isn't real, is it? It's, like I didn't know.
That's very Blair Witchy.
It is. I said it's like if Ray Bradbury had written In Cold Blood. So that's coming out in a couple months. So be on the lookout for that. It's really, really good.
Awesome. Well, terrific. Thank you so much, Carter and David, for coming on with Tattered Cover to talk about The Dead Husband. Thank you, readers, for coming here and supporting Tattered Cover, supporting Carter, supporting David. Again, I'm Adam with Tattered Cover. Find us at tatteredcover.com. Carter and David, where can we find you on social media, the internet? What are your links?
I'm just carterwilson.com, and thank you, Tattered Cover. You guys are awesome.
Yeah, I'm davidbellnovels.com, and then Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, David Bell Novels. Check me out there. And yeah, thanks for having me on. Always a treat to chat with Carter about his.
You too, David.
Yes. So, and we'll see each other in person again someday. Now that we're.
Will you be about your con in New Orleans?
I will be in New Orleans. Yeah.
I will be in New Orleans, so we're gonna have a drink at the hotel bar.
Party on, Wayne.
Readers, go to this conference, and you can have drinks with them at the bar too. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.